Hi there. So in this video, we're going to talk about one last thing related to factor markets, and it's one of Obama's chief economist's biggest regrets. He was actually the chief of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman, and one of the things that he talked about a lot towards the end of his term in the CEA and Obama's kind of econ geeks, right? Was this problem that we're going to look at, and that is monopsony. And you can see here Alan Kruger, Princeton University, and Posner at U Chicago, really focusing on the problem that monopsony faces for low-income workers. And this is the idea that you have certain markets where there's very few buyers of the product, right? That's what a monopsony is. A monopoly is very few, one, and monopoly, one seller. A monopsony would be one buyer. And so one of the problems with low-income workers, or facing them, is actually that, if you have only 2 or 3 companies that are hiring fast food unskilled laborers in a small town truck stop or whatever, those companies can kind of collude, if it's an oligopoly, and create a monopsony where there's really a very, very strong amount of power they have over workers' wages. Historically, we talked about monopsonies with things like coal mining towns, right? Where there's one employer in town, it's the coal mine, so you better not make him angry. But what we've seen is that as markets have gotten more concentrated in terms of products, right? If you have fewer and fewer firms selling a product, then you also have fewer and fewer firms hiring the workers who make the product. And that has some major implications for especially low-income workers, but also there's some points of research in higher income. So let's take a look at monopsony. As I already said, it's a market in which there's one or very few buyers. For labor markets, it's there's one or very few firms hiring the workers. And I'll give you a couple examples, right? A low-skilled workers in a small town, right? And thinking about like a truck stop where there's maybe only 2 or 3 gas stations and fast food restaurants. And so if you have very limited skills in one of these small town America things, you're facing a monopsony labor market. Think about university professors or researchers, right? University researchers researching something very specialized. If you think about it, there might be only a small subfield of people who do that work. And so the people who hire them would be a monopsonistic market, right? Where there's very few hiring companies. And that can have an effect on what they get paid and how many workers get paid. So the most important distinction for them is that the marginal factor cost doesn't equal the wage anymore. Just like we observed with monopoly, where the demand and the marginal revenue didn't come together anymore, in a monopsony, the marginal factor cost and the wage doesn't equal each other anymore, or the supply curve. So the supply curve for labor is just the quantity of labor and the wage that they're paid, right? So if you pay $1, you get 1 worker. You pay $2, you get 2 workers. $3, you get 3 workers. $4, you get 4 workers. $5, you get 5 workers. That's the supply function. But we're going to find that it's actually different from the marginal factor cost in this kind of a market where you only have one person or one company that's hiring the workers. So we'll kind of observe how this happens. What's the total cost if you have 1 worker? Well, $1. What's the total cost for 2 workers? $4. 2 times 2. 9, 16, 25. So the marginal factor cost is the change. And so the 0th one, to the 1 is 1. The next one, hiring the second worker costs, well, you pay the second worker 2, but it actually costs your company 3. Why does it cost your company 3? Well, you paid them 2, but what did you have to pay in addition for the first worker? Now you had to pay the first worker 2 as well. So you have to pay both of these workers $2. And when you do that, by raising the wage from 1 to 2, you have to give an extra $1 to the first worker, and now you're also paying the second worker 2. So the cost actually of hiring the second worker isn't 2, it's 3. When you hire the third worker, the cost to the company is 5. Because in order to hire that third worker, you had to pay them 3. Well, that means that you had to pay the second worker 3 and the first worker 3. And so you're adding basically $1 to the first and the second worker, who used to be earning 2. Now the first and the second worker are earning 3. So there's 2 additional dollars there. and then you have to pay this worker $3, so that's a total of 5. The next one costs 7 by the same idea, and then the next one costs 9. So it's very expensive, as you could see in this kind of market, to continually hire more and more workers. And what this does is it creates a very interesting mirror image of a monopoly. I mentioned earlier, so this is, we'll do it with workers, that you have like kind of a mirror image along the x-axis. Oh my goodness, my phone's getting blowed up. We'll see what that looks like later. So this is the mirror image, right? And if you kind of imagine, think back, what's a monopoly look like? I'm just going to draw a monopoly here so you have it for reference. You had a demand curve. You had, oh, that's a really steep marginal revenue. And you had marginal cost. And what we're going to see is that it inverts basically what that looks like. This is going to be, you have a upward sloping supply curve, and then you have a marginal factor cost that rises faster and faster. Now they're tied at the very first unit of worker. That's what we saw up here, right? MFC and the wage are the same at the first worker, but for the second one, the MFC is higher. The third one, it's higher still, and so forth and so on. So this gap gets wider and wider. At the same time, the marginal revenue product looks exactly the same that it did before, because this is just, if you remember, it's the marginal product of each worker times the price of the product. Now, the firm, the monopsonist, is going to hire where MRP equals MFC. It's the same rule as before. So they're going to look for where are those two things equal. We look MRP equals MFC. And so this tells us the quantity of workers that they're going to hire. That's how many quantity the firm hires, and the market, right? So you could also say it's the market because there's really only one company. But what are they going to pay them? Well, they're not going to pay them the marginal factor cost, right? Think about this picture up here. What does the second worker or the third worker get paid? Well, the third worker gets paid $3. They don't get paid this $5. That's how much it costs to hire them, but they get paid the wage, and the wage comes from the supply curve. So they're going to get paid here on the supply curve. Now, this picture that we've got tells us exactly that there's a market failure. We're not hiring the optimal quantity of workers that we would if it was perfectly competitive, because this is the demand for labor. This is the supply of labor. So we should be hiring at this wage, right? W perfectly competitive, we'll say, and we should be hiring this quantity perfectly competitive. So that's the optimal. So we can see that a monopsonist, these little gas stations and these little, these markets where you have very few hirers, they're going to pay a lower wage and they're going to hire too few of workers compared to what they would if it were more competitive. And this is where we have some really interesting stuff. So it's exactly the same problem as a monopoly, right? A monopoly overcharges and doesn't produce enough. A monopsonist underpays, they don't pay enough, and they don't hire enough. But we can fix it the same way that we fix a monopoly. A monopoly we fix with a price ceiling. We tell them, hey, you can't charge over a certain price, and then that changes their marginal revenue and it causes them to hire the right number. But we can actually fix that with a price floor, a minimum wage. So here's where this is going to get scary. I'm going to click the next slide. Don't be scared. Okay, now we're going to show what this would happen. This is usually the part where I have some students who are like, who get really mad because the implication of this model produces something that many students find unsettling. Now we know that this one was going to produce here, right? They're going to hire this many workers, Q star, W star. Well, what we could do is we could set a minimum wage, and we could say minimum wage here to get to this optimal. And if we do that, we'd say W min, then this firm will hire Q1 and they'll pay W min. Why would that be? Well, because by setting the W min, that's like saying this is our new marginal factor cost. It's just taking that MFC and tilting it flat and saying, hey, you have this minimum wage, so now you have to pay every single worker the same value, which they were doing that before, right? They might have been only paying $3 before, now they're paying $4. But what it does is has the effect of changing and eliminating the old marginal factor cost curve. This is their marginal revenue product. So if we have their marginal revenue product and a new marginal factor cost, well, it intercepts here. So they're going to hire Q1. But notice what they do. They hire more workers and they pay them more. So a minimum wage could actually, like a higher wage, forcing these companies to pay higher minimum wages could cause there to be more people get jobs and they get paid more. Crazy stuff, right? But here's where I'm going to get really nuts with you. What happens if you go too high? Right? You get a little too high. You're like way up here. Well, if you're way up here, well, they're going to hire where MFC, we'll say MFC2, right, intercepts with MRP. Well, in this point, you're still hiring more than you used to. I'm just going to say Q2. Let's zoom in a little bit. You're going to hire Q2 and you're paying them even more, right? So the harm is, well, you didn't quite get so many workers hired, but you still get quite a few workers, quite a few, a boost in your income. And if you got it all the way up to here, kind of missed right here, but if you got right to there, then in fact, you hire the exact same number of workers, right? So if you had like MFC 3 at this really high 550 or whatever that is, you could get the exact same number of workers and you could get a way higher wage. Now, the only one, if you notice, like right below in this picture below, is W4. If you were to pick one that was way too high, right, the new MRP and MFC, like if you picked way up here, MFC 4, well, then they're going to be, there is a point where you can't just keep raising the minimum wage. The MRP and this new MFC intercept here. And yeah, eventually you do have fewer workers getting hired compared to Q star where you were originally. But you'd have to, you have to kind of be judicious about this. But what this suggests is that there's room for helping workers and improving people's lives through things like a minimum wage. Okay, so I know that seems like a soapbox, but I think it's such a cool implication that I couldn't resist. I hope that helped you. I'll see you next time.